Can I ask everybody to go ahead and take your seats, please, if you would, please? Good morning, both to those here in the audience and to those who are joining us online. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We pay our respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to gather together for the first Perth US Asia Center event of the year 2021. It is nice to see people here both in person and is, I think, probably the new norm to be able to have many of you joining us online as well, freed from the bonds of geography and from early mornings as well. So thank you all for making the time to join us for a discussion of the foreign policy environment in which Australia finds itself at the beginning of 2021. Both on a personal level and on an institutional level, it's common to take stock of our environment in the new year. And so 2021 is a great opportunity for us to, particularly after a year like 2020, to look at the foreign policy environment, the challenges, the opportunities that present not just for Australia as a whole, but for the globe as we are increasingly intertwined. Many of the issues that we have dealt with in the last year and that face us today are issues where there is an understandable tension between hope and concern. And none more so than the probably the most transformative development of the last 12 months, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic. It's just striking to remember that it's almost a year ago this week that the initial reports coming out of Wuhan and the initial decisions were being made, and it's difficult for us to have foreseen then how transformed our lives would be today. I mentioned that there is a tension between hope and concern. If I look at my homeland and the just unimaginable chaos and death toll that, reaching 4,000 deaths a day, over 400,000 people who have perished because of this. The United Kingdom hasn't fared much better on a per capita basis. You look at other areas in the world, there's real cause for concern. At the same time, as we enter 2021, there's great cause for hope. There has been this miraculously speedy development of not one, but numerous vaccines, and now the real challenge is for governments across the globe, including our own, to figure out how to balance, the vaccine plus the other public health measures necessary to hopefully get under control something we failed to get under control in 2020. Now, having said that, it's also my apologies to those of you who are signing on from elsewhere in Australia. A wonderful time to be in WA. I think we all feel a particular sense of gratitude to be in our particular bubble within a bubble. And we appreciate the leadership of our political leaders, both on the state and national, that kind of provide that level of response. There are many other issues that I think are of concern. Obviously, the COVID pandemic has a tremendous impact on the economy as well. It's had a tremendous impact on our diplomacy. COVID has provided us with a very interesting metric or measure of the relative importance of diplomatic meetings, and that is the willingness of our ministers to do quarantine. So if you're going to have to do two weeks of quarantine before you do an international or after you do an international trip, that gives you a sense of it. So if you look back at 2020, our foreign and defense minister's decision to travel to the United States to participate in the OSMIN ministerial meetings, our defense minister's trip to Japan and Singapore in the region. In October, the decision of our foreign minister to travel to Japan to participate in a quadrilateral dialogue, which probably said a lot more about Chinese overreach than American outreach at that time. But those were all cases where that the dynamics of the year in foreign policy became quite clear. We can't ignore the economic impacts of COVID, and in a time where we take some reflection of 2020 and look forward to 2021, we also can't ignore the economic impact of a trade dispute with our largest trade partner, with China. I think many of you know that as the Perth U.S. Asia Center wrapped up its 7th year and we're entering into our 8th year, we made an early decision that across Australia there were many, many institutions focusing on China. And while we didn't ignore China, and you can't ignore China, we decided that our efforts would be better placed focusing on those key relationships that didn't get that same level of attention and yet remained equally important. Japan, ASEAN as a whole, Vietnam and Indonesia in particular, India, Japan, Korea, etc. And yet, having said that, if you look back at media coverage of the Perth U.S. Asia Center in 2020, you would be easily convinced that it was the Jeff Wilson Center, because our director of research, Jeff Wilson, is one of the best trade specialists in the country, and as a result, I think every single day was called upon to explain the latest twists and turns of our trade dispute with China. I don't anticipate those things go away, but there are, again, signs for hope as well if you follow Jeff recently and as we go forward too. Obviously, I can't but mention my homeland, the United States. Let me begin by saying there are certain advantages to having a naturalized Australian citizen up here rather than an Aussie, because number one, that means that you don't have to hear me talk about the cricket, which is good, right? But number two, that just gives me a unique perspective of what's gone on in the United States. And I'm not immune to the American tendency to sanctify politics in a way that we don't see the same degree here in Australia. And that for me, the capital, having spent 25 years working in Washington, D.C., the capital was hallowed ground. And so in the morning, or the afternoon rather, of January 6th, the morning of January 7th here, to see the U.S. Capitol breached in acts of violence, to see the deaths that were there, was shocking. Absolutely shocking to me on a personal level. And so much of the events of the last, not 12 months, but 4 years have been shocking to me. But like many other issues, there's this tension between deep concern and hope. And to see the election results in Georgia, to see Georgia elect its first African-American senator, to see them elect a young Jewish man to be senator, to see my home state of Arizona have 2 Democratic senators, and to see the election of Joe Biden with what is going to be, in less than 24 hours, a very progressive, extremely competent, extremely well-respected cabinet tackling the myriad of problems that we're facing. So all that to say, as we launch into the main event this morning, there couldn't be a more opportune time to take stake of Australia's interests. We're less than 24 hours out from the inauguration of Joe Biden. A year ago today, we would have been talking about nothing but bushfires. The Biden administration is going to come in with a heavy focus on climate change. So all of these together lead to an environment where it's very important for us here in Western Australia, for Australians writ large, to kind of look to our national leaders to get a sense for their views of the international environment, their views of the foreign policy climate, their views of the foreign policy challenges that face Australia. And in that regard, we're particularly delighted this morning to have an opportunity to hear virtually from the Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese. And to introduce the Leader of the Opposition, I'm delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, the former COO and the founder of the Perth U.S. Asia Center, the member for Brand, and the Shadow Minister for Trade, Madeleine King. So Madeleine, over to you.
Thanks very much, Gordon, and thanks to everyone for coming here today. I also will just join in acknowledging traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and to Indigenous people that may be present. It's a very interesting position I find myself in this morning, that I am being introduced by my former boss, and it's my task to introduce my current boss, the Honourable Anthony Albanese. Before I go on, I also want to acknowledge former ministers in the room. I can see former Minister Stephen Smith and also former Senator and Minister Chris Evans. I'm not sure if there are others, but I welcome you this morning, and also my federal parliamentary colleagues that are here today, and former parliamentary colleagues in Melissa Park, the former member for Fremantle. So thanks to you all very much for coming. I want to say thanks to Gordon and his team from the Perth US Asia Centre. I'm enormously proud of what the Perth US Asia Centre has achieved in the 4 years or 4.5 years since I left to run for election. It's one of my proudest recollections and achievements is the work we've done together, Gordon, and with others at the Perth US Asia Centre. It's really now set itself up as a very important thought leader in the dialogue on the Indo-Pacific. It is my great pleasure, as Gordon has said, to introduce the Honourable Anthony Albanese today, the leader of federal Labor opposition. We'd hoped Anthony would be here in person, but due to COVID restrictions, that's not possible. But thanks to the Perth US Asia Centre, we're able to introduce and have Anthony here remotely for a very important discussion and speech on the US-Australian alliance. As everyone in this room would know, Anthony is no stranger to the West. He has spent much time here in WA throughout his career. We have benefited here greatly from his advocacy, especially in regard to public infrastructure. As Minister for Infrastructure in the former Labor government, he supported and helped fund the sinking of the railway in Northbridge, which has transformed the city of Perth and its links to Northbridge and enabled the vibrancy of Yagan Square to emerge. And without that important funding and activity from the federal government, it would not have happened. And he also, of course, was a mainstay in the push for Gateway WA, which is a lot of us here in the room travel to the Perth airport to get to our jobs, and most of metropolitan Perth also travels to the airport to, or not most, but many of them, to do fly and fly out work to the mines that keep our economy going. And I can tell you every single one of them are very grateful for the improved access to a Perth airport that happened under the former Labor government in building Gateway WA. Anthony has regularly engaged in discussions on the US-Australia alliance, and as he will go into this further in his speech today, he's a regular participant in the American-Australian Leadership Dialogue, the last of which was held here in Perth, a very important event. His thoughts on the alliance today are very important, given we are, as Gordon said, less than 24 hours from a change in administration, in circumstances we could not have foreseen, and maybe some could have foreseen about 4 years ago when this current administration started. Gordon mentioned what we saw in the capital. I, for one, as someone who's publicly elected, and I know my colleagues probably share this similar thoughts, the thought of the people that vote for you wanting to burst into the room that you do a lot of your work and literally want to kill you is one of the most shocking things to have witnessed, and that happened in America. Our very close friend is one of the most distressing and shocking things I've ever seen in my life, and certainly my political life. And I think it'll take a bit to recover from, quite frankly, and there are other people in this room that have been elected and can imagine what that must have been like for the members of Congress that had to withstand that invasion into, you know, the place where elected people do their work is something that we'll all reflect on for a very long time. It is hopefully the beginning of the end. Tomorrow will be the beginning of the end of what has been a very divisive period of politics in the US, but also a period of divisive politics that has spread throughout the globe. And that's what I hope for. Whether it happens obviously remains to be seen. But with that, I will hand over to Anthony to share his thoughts on the Australia-US alliance. And thank you so much all for coming, and thank you, Anthony, for participating today.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Madeline, for the generous introduction, and I acknowledge as well the role that you played in the establishment of the US Asia Centre there in Perth, which plays such a vital role. And I thank Gordon for hosting us here, whether in person or virtually this morning. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, wherever we are, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge my federal colleagues who've joined us this morning. Not just Madeline, but the fantastic team we have from the West, including we have Louise Pratt, Josh Wilson, Matt Keogh, and Patrick Gorman joining us there today. And online we have Penny Wong, the Shadow Foreign Minister, and of course my Deputy Richard Marles, who is also the Shadow Defence Minister. And I want to also acknowledge two great West Australians who I worked so closely with in the last Labor government, Stephen Smith and Chris Evans, and thank them for giving me the honour of you joining us there this morning. Paul Keating was right when he said, when you change the government, you change the country. As we get reminded time and time again, when it's the United States government that changes, the impact radiates throughout the world. And as we meet together this morning, we're on the cusp of a new chapter in international relations. Today, Washington time, Joe Biden will be inaugurated as the 46th President of the United States of America. US democracy has shown its resilience. The attempts to undermine it have failed. But America did come close to the brink. The images we woke to on January 7 diminished those who seek to harm it. They explain why it was so important for all of America's allies to be utterly unambiguous when President Trump sought to undermine the democratic process. As so many have observed over the years, the most important example of America's power is not its military or economic prowess. It is the power of America's example. And that is what millions of people have been inspired by in struggles around the world against authoritarianism. And that is what America's adversaries most seek to undermine. The great tragedy of the recent past is the power of America's example has been diminished from within. It is in Australia's interest as a US ally to encourage the restoration of that power. And also because the world is weaker and more uncertain when America is weaker. Of course, as my friend, the WA Governor, Kim Beazley, always states, Australia must be the ally that the United States needs rather than the ally that it wants. If it wasn't already obvious, Malcolm Turnbull's difficult first phone call with Donald Trump demonstrated the challenges that building a strong relationship between our nation's leaders would face. But Scott Morrison went too far, partly out of his affinity with Donald Trump, partly because of the political constituency which they share. There is no doubt that Mr. Morrison put this affinity and his political interest first when he effectively went on a campaign rally stage with Donald Trump in Ohio. He neglected to meet with any senior Democrats over a week-long visit to the United States. And the fact that this was poor alliance management is highlighted by the fact that Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo, and Defence Secretary Esper all met with senior Labor Party leadership on their Australian visits. Recently, of course, unlike most world leaders, Scott Morrison refused to disavow President Trump's incitement of the storming of the Capitol. And I note that this morning, he has reaffirmed that failure to distance himself personally from President Trump's incitement. He remains afraid of the far-right extremist fringe dwellers who make up the bedrock of his personal support and who he cultivates through the avatars of Trumpists and conspiracy theorists like Craig Kelly and George Christensen. The fact that George Christensen is the chair of Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment, and other self-appointed international spokespeople like Andrew Hastie have been promoted, has facilitated them filling the vacuum that's been left by an absent foreign minister. Former Resources Minister Matt Canavan has seriously proposed an iron ore levy on exports to China. And even former diplomat Dave Sharma proposed in June last year the astonishing suggestion that Australia should recruit Russia for the perceived task of China containment, inspired by Donald Trump's comments on an accommodation with Vladimir Putin. Mr. Morrison wants to ride this tiger because he thinks he's on a political winner. But we have seen this month that the longer you ride it, the harder it is to dismount. The images we woke to on January 7th of the brutal assault on American democracy failed to stop Congress and the Senate fulfilling its constitutional duties. We all hope the FBI warnings of further attacks by armed militias are not realised, but the strength and resilience of US institutions have endured. In that darkest of hours, its leaders from both parties determined, once the capital was secured, to continue their work that very same day and show the American people and the world in the most emphatic way possible. And starting today, President Biden will bring arguably unprecedented experience to the role and a clear agenda for his first 100 days in office. Initially, much of that agenda will necessarily have a domestic focus. He will need to turn around the COVID-19 response, boost the US economy, and try to heal deep divisions. He will decisively revive US leadership on climate. Internationally, he will bring a strong personal commitment to restoring the US to what Bill Clinton once called the indispensable nation. The world he will face will be different from the one he faced as Vice President in the Obama administration. COVID-19 has swept the globe and reminded us how interconnected and interdependent we are. Global economic growth has been hard hit. Years of development gains have been reversed, and millions have been thrown back into poverty. Political actors pushing authoritarianism, protectionism, and isolationism have been emboldened. The increasingly tense relationship between the US and China has become a defining geostrategic trend of our time. Our region, already home to some of the world's most difficult flashpoints, is where new geopolitical struggles will play themselves out. And amid it all, of course, the clock keeps ticking on climate change, a fundamental threat that demands collective action to protect the planet that we all share. For Australia, the arrival of the Biden administration presents an opportunity to expand alliance cooperation on the challenges before the world and our region. This alliance was forged in World War II under Labor and one of our greatest Prime Ministers, the proud West Australian John Curtin, and we have deepened it each time we have been in government. Labor's support for the alliance will remain stronger than ever under a government that I lead. The close emotional ties that bound our relationship are important, but the alliance must be more than an extended celebration of mateship and a series of photo opportunities. It is underpinned by shared values and an alignment of interests, and we must never be complacent about either of these dimensions. We need to constantly discuss and renew them, sometimes even argue about them, and when we have reached a common understanding, act on them. Where interests are not completely aligned, we must be able to disagree and know that the relationship can nonetheless be sustained. Under President Trump, we saw the first steps in a retreat by the US from its historical role as the leader of the post-war international order, an order whose underlying values are those which Australians hold dear. It appeared the US was no longer interested in being the indispensable power. So I welcome Joe Biden's strong commitment to US leadership in the world and the desire to bring together US allies to face the challenges that I identified earlier. Australia must do all that we can to support the Biden administration in this effort, recognising that the shift we saw under Trump has deeper roots and these could continue to complicate Joe Biden's efforts. President-elect Biden understands that, Even with considerable investment in national power, the only tenable long-term US strategy for the projection of US power and leadership involves working collaboratively with its allies. In our region, we have seen not just the rise of China, but the first half of this century will see India become the world's second or third largest economy, and Indonesia emerge not just as an ASEAN influence, but the fourth largest economy and a global influence. The emphasis on allies will mean US expectations of Australia will continue to be high. We must be prepared to invest in the full range of our capabilities. Indeed, private sector trade and investment between our two countries and in the region is vital, including in advancing the social compact in areas including research. Our pool of savings in superannuation is a major strategic asset, which the current government seems determined to undermine. Of course, it has the potential to further drive infrastructure investment in Australia and the region, producing both positive returns for investors while delivering positive outcomes. In his April article in Foreign Affairs entitled "Why America Must Lead Again," Biden said this: "We can be as strong and smart at the same time." He then added something that should echo with Australians. Diplomacy should be the first instrument of American power. Diplomacy is not just a series of handshakes and photo ops. It requires discipline, a coherent policy-making process, and a team of experienced and empowered professionals. As President, I will elevate diplomacy as the United States' principal tool of foreign policy. It's an approach that we look forward to, and it's an approach characterised by the discipline and consistent leadership that Labor has delivered when we have been in government. This new phase of engagement with the US will also be an opportunity to better realise our shared objectives in the Indo-Pacific region. Australia should focus its engagement with the Biden administration on building an Indo-Pacific where the sovereignty of all regional states is upheld, international rules are respected, and open trade delivers prosperity for all. We should aim for real progress in addressing climate change and pandemic recovery, and action to ensure our experience with this pandemic won't be repeated. We should also look towards playing an active role in emerging challenges, such as cybersecurity and the impact of artificial intelligence, consistent with the constructive role that former Labor governments played in areas including arms control. We should seek steady and predictable engagement, an engagement guided by a deep understanding of regional countries' interests, not attempts to force them to pick sides. It has been reassuring to see the extent to which the Biden team has already acknowledged the imperative of strategic engagement and leadership in the Indo-Pacific region. Joe Biden's strong commitment to climate change action will be warmly welcomed in the Pacific. Australia's interests call for greater, more strategic effort from the US in Southeast Asia. As a driver of economic growth and a focal point of great power competition, it is a region that requires consistent support from our key players. As this audience in Perth knows, the Indian Ocean region is also of growing importance, reflected in the fact that the last face-to-face Australian-American leadership dialogue was held successfully in Western Australia. Further encouraging the US to be more engaged will require Australia to lead the way through our own actions and lift our game in the region. Unfortunately, the Morrison government has failed to deliver a clear strategy. It has funded its Pacific step up through a Southeast Asia step down. It has slashed $11.8 billion from the aid program and halved our development assistance to Indonesia, our closest neighbour and one of our most important relationships. In Australia, the study of Indonesia has been at crisis levels for some time, and the Morrison government's attacks on the humanities is exacerbating this. It's also ignored pleas from regional leaders, including President Jokowi, to act on climate change. It has cut our diplomatic footprint. Australia should be doing all it can to help show the way for the US to support Indo-Pacific regional pandemic recovery, reinforce ASEAN's centrality, and strengthen regional architecture. This includes lifting US leadership engagement and boosting US integration with the region. We hope that the Biden administration prioritises attendance at the East Asia Summit and gives close thought to joining the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Obama administration recognised the geostrategic significance of the CPTPP, and we hope this will be reprised under Joe Biden. I understand that this holds domestic sensitivities for his administration. Indeed, Labor shares some of the concerns voiced in the US, such as those around the need to ensure labour and environmental issues are properly addressed in trade agreements. But with the centre of economic gravity in the world shifting to the Indo-Pacific, the US absence from key regional trade architectures must be addressed. The Biden administration will inherit a more challenging relationship with China. Recent decades have seen China's economic development lift more of its citizens out of poverty than at any place and at any time in human history. It is a remarkable achievement. Globalisation and the relatively ubiquitous nature of technology means that population will continue to drive China's ongoing rise. The economic rise of China has consequences for global power. China, under Xi Jinping, has taken a new direction, one in which it increasingly seeks to assert its growing power, even when that contravenes accepted and agreed international rules. As a result, the bipartisan shift in Washington towards strategic competition with China is likely to endure. How the US, under President Biden, approaches this strategic competition, works with allies and defends its key interests, will be crucially important to Australia. From promoting human rights and the rule of law, investing in defence and broader technological capability, defending against threats, physical and grey zone, and identifying areas of cooperation. Biden's approach to the China relationship will have global and local implications. It's more likely to succeed if President Biden plays to America's strengths and puts some clearer definition around the terms of future US-China competition. This should allow the US and its allies, such as Australia, to defend clear red lines, but also enable coexistence. And that is clearly also in Australia's interests. A key task for Australia will be ensuring that any settling point that is reached between the two powers will take account of the interests of the countries of the Indo-Pacific. Labor sees the need for a US regional strategy that strengthens the international rules, provides credible offers of support to regional countries, and boosts prosperity. One that ensures clear expectations about how countries should behave are set, as well as providing opportunities to work collectively in response to common threats. It was an encouraging start to see incoming National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's expression of solidarity for Australia in the face of China's recent trade sanctions against our exporters. This stood in contrast to the Trump administration's trade war with China, which saw little attention in Washington to the risk that Australian farmers would actually lose market share to US competitors because of Chinese actions. It was a dereliction of duty for Scott Morrison to say and do nothing about the implications of the US-China Phase 1 trade deal. This creates the possibility of a paradoxical outcome where markets in China, which have been closed off to Australian exporters, are opened up to our American competitors in sectors including meat, wine, and timber. You can't manage differences with an alliance partner by simply ignoring them, especially when literally tens of thousands of Australian jobs are on the line. Even more important, we'll be working with the US and other like-minded countries to find ways to ensure Any potential coercion is successfully resisted and its impacts mitigated. This is why an American reinvestment in the global rules of the road under Biden is welcomed. The article in Foreign Affairs by Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan, who will be key players in the Biden administration, says a lot in its title, Competition Without Catastrophe, How America Can Both Challenge and Coexist with China. The statement, and I quote, although coexistence offers the best chance to protect US interests and prevent inevitable tension turning into outright confrontation, it does not mean the end of competition or surrender on issues of fundamental importance. Instead, coexistence means accepting competition as a condition to be managed rather than a problem to be solved. They argue against simplistic analogies with the US-Soviet Union Cold War and argue China is an essential partner. Again, to quote, global problems that are difficult enough to solve even when the United States and China work together will be impossible to solve if they fail to do so. Climate change first among them, given that the United States and China are the two biggest polluters. A host of other transnational challenges, economic crisis, nuclear proliferation, global pandemics, also demand some degree of joint effort. This imperative for cooperation has little parallel in the Cold War. In this, it is my view that this perspective is consistent with a mature approach from Australia. COVID-19 has underscored that for Australia, effective multilateralism should be our default practice and posture. It is dangerous for Australia to be part of efforts to tear down useful multilateral institutions because there are a lot of problems we can only solve through cooperation. In other words, far from being a feel-good exercise, Australian leadership in the multilateral system is an extension of our national power. There is so much for us to gain by engaging more creatively and enthusiastically. It is therefore a good thing for Australia that our principal ally is also strongly committed to multilateral cooperation. We look forward to welcoming the United States back to the Paris Accords. Labor's position on climate change shares so much with that of the Biden team, and we are well positioned to cooperate closely with the US and the many other key allies and partners who take climate change seriously. Scott Morrison's stubborn resistance to joining the global consensus on climate change has led to his government now being totally isolated on the international stage, frozen in time while the world warms around them. With John Kerry being charged with marshalling international support for greater global ambition, we can expect Mr. Morrison's isolation to create tension in our alliance and damage our interests. It isn't just the threat posed by climate change that has worsened. The threat posed by authoritarianism has also gained momentum. The growing confidence of autocracies and their willingness to engage in action designed to undermine democracy calls for closely coordinated international action. And so the Biden team's proposed Summit for Democracy is also very welcome. It is clearer than ever, following what we saw at the US Capitol, that supporters of democracy must act collectively to defend our values. We also look forward to Australia working more productively with the US in the World Trade Organization. As Australia's current disputes with China underline, we have a deep interest in a world where trade takes place in accordance with clear rules and liberal principles. Working effectively with the new US administration at the global level is going to require quite a lot of Australia. While Labor has a track record of global leadership, we have seen our Prime Minister take aim at, quote him, negative globalism and, to quote again, unaccountable internationalist bureaucracy. Let's call this for what it was. Mr. Morrison pandering to President Trump and those who follow him in Australia. And the coalition has deliberately run down our diplomatic capability, making Australia weaker in prosecuting our national interests. In a world of sovereign states, acting together does not happen automatically. political leadership and diplomacy are the vital skills that enable it. We've been living with the pandemic for nearly 12 months, but we've seen no leadership from this government on how Australia is working with the WHO and key countries to ensure our resilience to future pandemics. Indeed, it burned capital with a poorly managed call for an inquiry, which was always going to take place. The government sought a splashy announcement when it should have been doing the behind-the-scenes diplomatic legwork to generate global support for a thorough investigation. We've seen no leadership from Australia in rallying progress towards a global economic recovery or advocating for much needed support for our near neighbours in forums like the G20. This is a stark contrast to our role in the international response to the global financial crisis. And when it comes to climate, we are turning our backs on all the nations that matter most to us on one of the issues that matters most to them. We can't secure our interests alone. We need to work alongside the US and our allies, as well as aligned partners, to achieve our goals. Australia needs to lead, including within our alliance with the US, and not just rely on old assumptions. In conclusion, can I say that the Biden-Harris victory was historic and inspiring for many Americans and Australians alike. A woman of colour has been elected to high office. A cabinet that reflects modern America has been nominated. The program, articulated by the incoming administration, represents hope for progress on so many issues of central importance to Australia. We hope to warmly welcome members of the Biden administration here soon. The task before us represents a challenge, but it's exciting. We need long-term vision, wise strategy, and consistent advocacy of our national interest. Scott Morrison will have his work cut out, given his attendance at partisan events with Donald Trump and his failure to build any connections with the Democrats. An obvious starting point for the government would be for him to come to the table on climate change. The Morrison government would have to explain the absurdity of its arguments about the alleged costs of achieving net zero emissions. But to be increasingly isolated is an untenable position. President Biden's inauguration today represents a triumph of hope over fear, common purpose over division. After a difficult 2020 for the world, that is an aspiration which we in Australia can pursue with enthusiasm. I thank you for your attendance and for the invite to speak with you today.
Madeleine King, who previously introduced as member for Brand, to join us in the panel, as well as Professor Stephen Smith, who needs no introduction here, former member for Perth, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, former Minister of Defence, and most importantly from us, member of the board of the Perth US Asia Centre, as well as the chairman of the board of the Public Policy Institute and the Defence and Security Program at UWA. So, if I switch back to this mic here, thank you. I'm going to betray my age a little bit in that not just in the days before Netflix, but in the days before DVDs or even VHS, we used to look forward to once a year, twice a year on broadcast television, they would play The Wizard of Oz. And of course, as a young child, I was scared of the monkeys, the flying monkeys. But as I got a little bit older, I became scared of kind of the wizard, with this giant head, over a crystal kind of palace there. So what we decided to do is kind of replicate that experience. So we have above us the leader of the opposition, but this is the Labour Wizard of Oz. And so we've got greenery behind him rather than green crystal, so it's a little bit more environmentally friendly. But it's a wonderful opportunity for us to have a conversation now and to be joined by two of my colleagues here from WA. Mr. Albanese, you will not be surprised to know that when the Perth US Asia Centre was launched some 7.5 years ago, and when Stephen was still in government, there were several fundamental presumptions behind our creation. Number one was that there was a critical mass of global caliber strategic thinkers in Perth that would warrant a foreign policy think tank here. And our last 7 years has proven that to be true in spades. You can just look out at this wonderful audience and those who are joining us online to know that's true. But the second presumption was that perspectives in WA were sufficiently different from those that we would hear in the East Coast as to warrant a WA voice. And so our role for a good chunk of the last 7 years has been making sure that we, on a steady level, continue to make sure that Canberra is paying attention to not just to WA, but to the Indian Ocean. And so many of the themes that you hit in your speech are themes that are very familiar to our audience here in Western Australia. And it's why we're particularly delighted to be joined by the Shadow Minister for Trade and the former Minister Stephen Smith for this conversation. So if I can kind of manage this as best as I can, I'm going to start off with a couple of themes that were already touched on in the speech, and then we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience that we have here live as well. And I can't help but start where you left off, and that is in developments in the United States. As you might imagine, I have a countdown watch. You know, my team and I are trying to decide whether or not we're going to wake up at 1 a.m. in the morning to watch the actual inauguration speech. It's going to be a historic period of time. But Mr. Albanese, you started off by mentioning that the diminishment of American power was a deep concern, and that it was in Australia's interest to encourage the restoration of American power. So I was wondering if you might talk a little bit more, and you've hit several key points in there, about what Australia can do to encourage and support the restoration of American power, and maybe kind of re-emphasize that. And then I want to turn that same question to Madeline and Stephen as we go on to the discussion. So over to you, Mr. Albanese.
Thanks very much. I'm not sure about the Wizard of Oz analogy, how I feel with that, even though I do have a dog called Toto. So it's difficult for me to see what the venue looks like there. I'm speaking to you from my home. Look, I think that in part it comes from the quote that I gave Kim Beazley credit for, quite rightly, but that others have said as well, that one way to do it is for Australia to be a true friend and to be the ally that the US needs, rather than necessarily the ally that the US wants. And by that, of course, what Kim means as a strong supporter of the alliance, and I mean, is that we need to encourage in a practical way US engagement with the region. Now, often we do have a different perspective that we can offer due to our geographical location, due to our connections. And you're right in referring to the different perspective that we have within our nation as well, and particularly there in the West. The American leadership dialogue that was held in Perth was different in its nature from one if it had been held in Sydney or Melbourne. That's the truth. There was much more a focus on not just China and the rise of China, but also, of course, on India and Indonesia in particular. And I think that perspective of engagement with our partners is something that we can really offer. When I spoke about our diplomatic withdrawal as well, the diplomatic corps has seen cuts from Australian presence in Japan, in the Philippines, in Papua New Guinea, but also in China, in terms of a human rights position that used to be present in our embassy in Beijing. Now, Australia in the region can play a critical role as a partner and an ally of the United States in working together in common interest to make sure that we have that we deal with, I guess, the US-China strategic competition, which is there and which will continue to be there for our lifetimes. By engaging in the region, Australia, I think, as a nation with the heritage and connections that we have, can provide, I think, a really important perspective to the US as an ally, as a partner, not a subservient one, but one that recognises that we have those common interests. And in the context of the inauguration and swearing in tomorrow at 1 a.m. Our time, I think the fact that we will have an administration that is so interested in engaging in the region, and key players like Kurt Campbell, who have very good relations with Australia, the range of key players. I shared a platform with Pete Buttigieg at the dialogue in Washington a couple of years ago. Is going to be the Transport Secretary. So many of the Biden administration's key appointments will have connections with Australia, which will put us in good stead. Australia, when we do our best in foreign policy, we punch above our weight. I attended with Stephen Smith and Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan the first G20 meeting in London. We punched above our weight there, and we can do so again. We're in the fastest growing region of the world, and that presents, in human history, that presents a huge opportunity for us as a valued ally of the US.
And if I can go next to you, I noted in the opposition leader's speech that he referenced an Australian initiative to get the United States to join the CPTPP. And I noticed our director of research pop up with a good smile. That's a good development. What do you view, particularly given your purview, as things that Australia might do to help encourage the restoration of American power?
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Anthony. There's no doubt the CPTPP is an important part of regional trade infrastructure, and that America withdrew from it was not a good thing. And that in that 2016 election, it was 2017. 2016. So, yeah, it was turned into it was weaponised. The international trade was by both sides. So it was picked up by the Republicans, and then by President Trump particularly, or soon not to be, and the other candidate, Hillary Clinton, got on board. So there became no options about the TPP at the time. That agreement survived that election through the efforts principally driven by Japan, but also Australia. I think is a very important achievement in international trade. I don't think joining it will be one of their top priorities because of the poison that was put onto that agreement from those times, from that election. So I think it will take some time for the US to come around to joining it. And there are quite significant challenges in rejoining it. It's not like the recent regional comprehensive economic partnership, which is more open to parties joining or coming back on board. For America to come back into the TPP, I think is a more complex question, and I'm sure Jeff will be able to confirm that in some essay that he'll do that we'll all get to read, and he'll be on television about it shortly. But it is no doubt an important thing for Australia and our ally Japan to press the Biden administration on straight away, because if they did rejoin, it does make it a larger market, of course, in times of difficulty for Australia's trade. But equally, just the moral point of America being part of that regional trade infrastructure is critically important, while you've got the regional comprehensive economic partnership with China involved, and obviously no US. So it will be interesting. It's interesting that the UK talks about the TPP as well, about joining it, which is really quite interesting, given it's not really a Pacific nation. I think America's, I would say, recovery is important, and it needs to rebuild trust, I think, with generationally, quite frankly. So while this audience may have a greater understanding of where America's influence lies and its importance to us. There is a couple of generations that are younger that do not, and they've witnessed 4 years of, some pretty awful stuff. And you ask my 23-year-old nephew what he thinks of the US. Well, I'm not going to tell you what he thinks of it, that would be a shared sentiment that's quite wide. And I know Ambassador Culverhouse, I presume, who ends his placement here today, that was one of his ambitions to reinvigorate the youth engagement with the US, but it was an impossible task, for the administration he served, and how the US goes about rebuilding that trust. It will obviously build on its soft power, which is immense, and quite frankly, it can't really be. There's no competition to US soft power with Hollywood and the music industry and so forth like that. China can't compete with that and never will, because it just doesn't have those creative industries because of its regime. So it just has to build on that and rebuild that trust. And some of that will come through a comprehensive regional strategy, which Anthony mentioned in his speech, one that it's coherent and shared and built together with important allies such as Australia, to ensure that the US does actively engage in the region, rather than the notion of pushing different nations to pick sides. It will be that deep engagement and sustained in a long-term plan, not just throwaway lines and statements and press releases and so forth, and tweets, which is sadly what we've really become used to in this last 4 years.
Although mercifully not for the last week.
Yes, great.
Stephen, anything you might add to that?
Well, I think the key point, and Anthony made this in his speech, is that with Biden swearing in, we've got the United States back in the mainstream. And that's really important. So you'll have essentially a mainstream, centrist Democrat administration. We're going through big change globally. So for a nanosecond after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw the United States as the all-powerful, sort of great superpower. Then with the rise of China, we saw the emergence of a possible duopoly or competition between two great powers. If you're going through a period of strategic competition and then a period of multipolar power, with, as Anthony made the point, the rise of India, the rise of Indonesia, we'll end up with an Indo-Pacific multipolar world. You can't have one of the key components of that withdrawing from the fray. And the reality is that Trump withdrew the United States from the fray. So bringing the United States back into the mainstream of international relations conversation, back into the mainstream of multilateralism, back into the mainstream of trade, all these things immediately change the dynamic. Now, as Madeline said, it's not going to be easy for Trump, whether it's for Biden, whether it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They won't get to that on day one, but they will get to it. But you've got the United States back in the mainstream. So I think the significance of Anthony's speech from a domestic perspective is it's signalling that under Anthony's leadership, and if Anthony became Prime Minister, there'd be mainstream Australian public policy in foreign affairs, national security and international relations and trade, reflective of previous Labor administrations. But today and tomorrow, the United States gets back into the mainstream, and that has beneficial repercussions which we have not just missed over the last 4 years, but we've seen work which has been diametrically opposed to that approach.
Oh, fantastic. All of you have actually touched on this broader question of multilateralism, and Mr. Albanese, in your speech, you used that wonderful Australian framing of the rules-based order on which we rely so much. I wonder if I might get you to tease out a little bit more the importance of multilateralism to Australia and Australia's role in securing American participation in multilateralism. And to give a little bit of context to that, if you're a Middle East specialist or you're kind of Australian media and you tend to focus on the alliance relationship with the United States, so much of it focuses on Australia's role supporting the US in Iraq or Afghanistan, et cetera. But if you look at our region, the Indo-Pacific, there's a very strong case to be made that there isn't a single multilateral initiative in which the United States has joined where Australia wasn't there first and actively lobbying the United States to get involved, whether it is the ASEAN Regional Forum or APEC or the East Asia Summit or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, et cetera. And so that's why I was very encouraged to hear your remarks on the CPTPP. But so if I can continue this conversation putting it in the context of the rules-based order and multilateralism and Australia's role in getting the United States to re-engage on the rules-based order?
Well, Australia, as a mid-ranking power, has a particular interest in multilateral forums. And that's why, historically, whether you look at the creation of the UN, where the former Labor leader was the first president of the UN in Doc Ebbett, or whether it be Paul Keating's role in regional institutions with APEC, whether it be the role that Kevin Rudd and Stephen and others played in the formation of the G20 during the global financial crisis. Australia has always recognised that we have a particular interest in multilateralism and in those forums. We simply don't have the weight by ourselves to go off like perhaps the US and China do, or Europe as an entity for that matter. And that's why that strategic engagement through multilateral forums historically has been so important. I think Australia's participation in the WHO, for example, is important. The WHO has no doubt some weaknesses, but if it wasn't there, what replaces it? Is it stronger? Is it weaker? Is the World Health response better or worse? And the US withdrawal from the WHO, as an example, like its withdrawal from Paris. Paris not being perfect, but global problems require global solutions. And unless you're engaged in it, then you can't be a part of providing that solution. So Australia has a particular interest in encouraging the US engagement and involvement. And I'm absolutely confident from the Biden administration's own comments from Joe Biden down that is one of the things that we're going to see. Even in areas like disarmament, the withdrawal of the Trump administration from the engagements with Iran at the same time as they had increased engagement with the North Koreans, jarred for people who want orderly outcomes. And I think that we can have some positive perspective going forward on that. And Australia is a consistent partner on so many areas. Australia has bipartisan commitments to rules-based orders. We do follow trade organisations that we sign. We don't regard it as something that we can just dismiss. We don't engage in some of the activities that have created tension with China over things like intellectual property. We have strong laws here, and we take rules-based orders very seriously. So I think we can be a very strong partner, and one which, when the US is looking at the change in its perspective, the fact that when they join international bodies and participate once again in areas like the Paris Accord, they can look to Australia with some knowledge about the certainty that will come out of that participation is, I think, something that's very positive indeed.
Thanks. Stephen, anything to add to that?
Well, Anthony made the point in his speech that a big population helps. And so in the case of China and also in India, having 1.4 billion people really helps give you economic weight and then, as a consequence, political, strategic and military weight. We're a small population in a large landmass country, so having strong relations with key bilateral partners, whether it's a security relationship with the US and also a very strong investment relationship with the US, whether it's a trade relationship with China or post-World War II, a trade relationship with Japan and Korea, and now trying to grow better trade relationships with India and Indonesia. We've been very good at having bilateral relations with key partners, but then regionalism and multilateralism works for Australia. It works for a small population, large landmass country where regionalism, multilateralism and rules of the road work. And so we've been very good at getting ourselves into relevant regional architecture early, but then also persuading other countries, including and in particular the US on key matters, to join as well. So we were very influential in getting the United States to sign up for the Treaty of Amity and Comity, which enabled it to become a member of the East Asia Summit, which will return now to being the most significant regional forum that we have, where all of the key Indo-Pacific powers are in the same room at the same time talking about economics and security. So we've been very good at that, and that's in part been driven by our small population, and until more recently, where we're now much closer to the economic centre of gravity, being at the end of the road, the end of the railway line, or at the end of the air routes, being a distant country. So that's worked well for us. From time to time, any administration will have its differences and difficulties with the US. Generally, they're done behind closed doors. But whilst we don't overstate it, we have always been a significant influence on the US making decisions about our part of the world. And I can't recall a conversation with a serious US interlocutor when I was a minister which didn't ask the question, what's Australia seeing and thinking and viewing about Indonesia? What's Australia seeing and thinking and viewing about China? And that, I think, with the Biden administration, with so many of the key players having been at the heart of the rebalance and the pivot, they'll be very open to a conversation from Australian officials and Australian public policy activists about what they should now do. And so there'll be a receptive ear. As Madeline said about the TPP, it won't be the first thing they do on day one, but they will come to it. And people who we're very familiar with, whether it's Kurt or Jake, will be very receptive to our views.
Madeline?
Thanks, Gordon. It's hard to underestimate the importance of multilateral institutions to Australia, as everyone's pointed out. Its status as a middle power with a low population that really absolutely depends on international trade for its prosperity. It's one of the reasons the Cairns Group was developed, and Australia was a leader in developing the Cairns Group, part of the agricultural group of trading nations in the WTO, to seek to have more evenly or even no tariffs in agricultural products. Still a work in progress, and arguably a group that could be rejuvenated within the World Trade Organisation. I think what we've seen with the US-China deal or purchasing agreement, as I like to think of it, is a precise example of what the multilateral nature of the WTO is meant to avoid. Where the two largest economies in the world get together to run up a purchasing agreement to the exclusion of other nations. And that's precisely what we've seen. It's precisely what's happened. Arguably Australia's exports, a number of them have been affected by this agreement, and we're not the only country that suffers as a consequence of that trade deal / purchasing agreement. So we do have to get America to think more about the multilateral and not the bilateral deals, because when you do a deal, you're excluding a lot of people and you're actually running contrary to the ideals behind multilateralism, which is that shared understanding of rules that can lead to a more fair international trading system for the benefit of more nations, which is in everyone's interest, particularly in this region. If we are all singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak, we all play by the same rules, we can all access each other's markets, it will be better for everyone.
Fantastic. Now, I've got a long list of questions, but one of the indicators of a really comprehensive speech that is, as the speech was going on, one by one, they were all answered in the course of the text. And so rather than me continue to drone on and recognizing that we're running out of time, I'd like to turn to our audience here in the room with a couple of questions. We've got a microphone. And I'll ask you to just identify yourself to make sure. Anthony, Mr. Albanese, I think we've got a camera so you'll see the audience. It may not be quite as big as our heads up here. But we'll start with Melissa Park here. Where's the microphone there? And then we'll go back here to Haley, then over to here. Yeah. So, very good.
Hello. Anthony, it's really good to see you looking so well after your recent near-death experience. I think the storming of the Capitol was really just the most recent and most serious example of the rise and the militancy of the extreme right, which has been identified as a major security risk by the United States and Australian security services. Of course, we have elements of the extreme right here in Australia as well. Just a question about how you think we can work together with the United States and Australia in dealing with that challenge.
Thanks very much, Melissa, and I acknowledge your presence there as well as a former ministerial colleague. And yes, I am feeling a bit better. When I say Labor leaders should crash or crash through, I probably shouldn't have taken it quite so literally, but I'm going okay. Look, I think the lesson of the US and the storming of the Capitol building for me is that when you have more and more extreme comments made, you've got to call it out. And my concern is that if you saw, I guess, an escalation whereby people were more polite about the comments that were being made from some in the leadership of in the US over a period of time, and it ended up there's no question that President Trump clearly did incite some of what we saw with that insurrection. And here in Australia, we have members of the House of Representatives and the Senate who've backed conspiracy theories here with regard to coronavirus, but also with regard to the very events that we saw on January 7, saying that they weren't really Trump supporters, they were Marxists pretending to be Trump supporters. These people hold significant positions, as I said in my speech. George Christensen chairs a body that is in charge of the Parliament in terms of trade and investment. It should be called out. People from mainstream politics with mainstream views, whether they be in Labor or the coalition or academic circles or the business community, need to call it out and say that it's inappropriate for someone who holds those views to hold such a position. Because what we know is that being silent about it doesn't mean that it goes away. It just means that it is encouraged, and I think that is one of the lessons of January 7.
Thank you. Unless you have something you want to chime in on this?
I want to take it from a completely different perspective and angle than Anthony did. I think Biden's single biggest domestic problem is how can he somehow reinstill into the economic disaffected and the economically alienated a view that there's a chance now that they can rejoin the American dream. There are a range of different types of people who support Trump, and Trump was very Machiavellian at getting people in his cart. But there are the right-wing extremists and the nutters, but there are also people who live in what we would describe as rural and regional America, who don't have economic opportunity, who were brought up on the basis of if you work hard, then your children will have a better chance than you have. And for many people throughout the back blocks of the United States, and you see it reflected by the electoral map, those people believe that they've lost their chance of the American dream. And so they went for something which was not Republican, not Democrat, because the Republicans and the Democrats had failed them over a long period of time. So that to me is Biden's single biggest challenge. How can he reinstill a view into people who supported Trump because they are economically alienated and disaffected from the mainstream? How does he reinstill into them a view that they and their children have got some chance of the American dream? And that's a really hard challenge for him. But my view is if he doesn't address that and make some progress, those underlying structural problems will just continue to bedevil the United States.
Anything to add? Or?
I entirely agree with what Stephen has just said. It is a challenge, and it's a nation, America, that doesn't have what we have, which is a healthcare system that will actually support you. So, and people in these backlogs, so to speak, suffer health crises as they are now. There's, that's almost terminal, right, economically for them and their situation, because there's no healthcare around. So, and also the social safety net. These are things we fought for many years to have, and we've protected as a Labor Party, and there's some bipartisan support, but not a great deal for all of it. But the thing is, without those, we may have a similar situation. Fortunately, we do have the social safety net and Medicare, and so it is a more stable society, and that's not the case in America, and that's a massive challenge for the incoming president to address.
Thank you. Next question is Hayley Channer. Hayley is the most recently joined member of the Perth US Asia team. She spent the last 5 years in the Department of Defence and has joined us as a Canberra-based senior research fellow. We're delighted to have her here in Perth to make sure that we get her fully indoctrinated this week before she goes back and resumes her post. So Hayley, welcome. The question to you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Thank you, Mr. Albanese. My question goes to how do we hold US attention and interest over the next 1 to 2 years? So clearly, President Biden, he's facing sort of a triple threat: the pandemic, which is killing thousands of Americans every day, a political crisis, and I think increasingly a sort of social and racial crisis in the United States. And although he has Kurt Campbell to remind him of the importance of the Indo-Pacific, obviously Washington DC is very much closer to Europe and Russia. And I'm wondering, how does an Australian government get and hold US attention, not just on the Indo-Pacific, not just on Australia, but on Perth and Western Australia?
See, she is indoctrinated. That's good.
Well, it is. She good save at the end there. I think that one issue, we shouldn't underestimate those interpersonal relations that are important with people like Kurt and Jake and others in the administration, as well, to be able to engage and to make sure that Australia does have our voice heard. I think in practical terms, the Biden administration will be very open to it. The article in Foreign Affairs by Joe Biden about diplomacy and about working with partners was very strong there. And the fact that he's appointed Kurt Campbell for that very important strategic role in our region will be very positive as well. So I'm quite hopeful for it. I think the government, the current government, needs to reach out. At the same time, I'm confident that we in the Labor Party have reached out already to the new administration to renew acquaintances, and will be in a strong position to do so should we be in a position to form government in a year or so's time. There's no doubt that the immediate focus of the Biden administration will be, of course, trying to get on top of the pandemic. We've just ticked over to 400,000 deaths in the United States. It will be, and I concur with Stephen's comments, it will be reaching out to those people who regard themselves as having a lost stake in the promise of America, as the great political philosopher Bruce Springsteen sang about, the promised land that the US offers. Many people just don't feel like that in the so-called Rust Belt states and others. And that will be, the immediate challenge will be domestic. But I'm confident as well that the Biden administration will be very keen to engage internationally, and that means the very nature of the challenges with strategic competition with China being one of the core elements of global policy in the coming years, that will ensure that Australia has a focus there.
Well, thank you for the shout out to one of my favorite political philosophers. I appreciate that. It's wonderful. With apologies to Steve and Madeline, I want to get one more question from the floor, then we'll kind of do a wrap-up session. John, if we could go to you. John Goodlad from the Australian Institute for International Affairs.
Thanks very much. Mr. Albanese, a question for you. As President of the Institute of International Affairs, I've heard a lot of speeches over the years about the strategic situation in the Indo-Pacific, etc., but I've never heard superannuation mentioned in the same speech. So I'd be very interested in how we expand upon that as part of our national interest. And I think you mentioned in terms of sort of like a Southeast Asian bond or something like that. And just before you answer that, forget the Wizard of Oz dimension to it. I understand the response to that, but we did see Toto in the background. Yes. What a beautiful little prop. Thanks very much.
Toto's been very well behaved. There are birds behind me that she's been very interested in. Look, in terms of superannuation, I just think that, we have this debate, which at the moment is pretty narrow about super and what it does and whether it should be 9.5 or 10 and whether people should be able to buy their own house. It's a very individualist perspective. What is ignored is that superannuation is an economic asset. It's a strategic national asset. For the first time, Australia can be a net exporter of capital. That puts us in a very strategic position. And it seems to me that when we have debates about, what's the debate about the BRI? It's a debate that says that China has sought to use the need for investment for countries in our region to use the BRI as a tool to exercise political influence. There is no reason whatsoever why superannuation in investment in infrastructure and in capital can't be something that doesn't just build in Australia, but also there is investment now overseas. We're buying, super funds are buying roads in Canada and in all sorts of places in the region and vice versa. It just seems to me in terms of our economic influence that there's a real opportunity for us if we stop seeing super as just about the individual, which it is, about providing a quality of life for retirees, for retirement savings. It's very important. But it's also this national asset which has been cut down by over $40 billion, by the way, in the last year with that withdrawal of savings. That also is a withdrawal of opportunity by definition of investment, whether it be here in Australia or in the region. Super, of course, has to produce a return, and it should prioritise those returns. But there are other benefits for it as well. And I think our economic engagement in the region, it's not enough to wag our finger at East Timor for having a wonderful new building paid for by the Chinese. They are going to look towards countries which are developing in the region are going to look towards investment opportunities, and there's enormous opportunity for Australian engagement in the region, one of which we're seeing in the Northern Territory, to give just one, the powering a fair portion of Singapore's future energy needs from the world's largest solar farm that will be developed in the Northern Territory. There's no reason as well why the West in particular can benefit from powering Indonesia, as we see a growth in the middle class. The first thing that people will do is buy air conditioners and to increase their energy usage. There's an enormous opportunity for us to be an exporter of renewable energy, and that's why I see a renewable energy superpower. And part of that investment can, of course, be funded through our pool of national savings through superannuation that's now well over $3 trillion.
Well, Mr. Albanese, it's a wonderful way to bring this conversation full circle. We started out with some broad principles, but to get down to kind of where the rubber meets the road, specific things that can be done. Stephen, as a minister, you were the first government official in the region to use the term Indo-Pacific in a government document, 2013 Defense White Paper. It's now since become, the calming phrasing, and obviously we, sitting in WA, kind of checked that box during the course of your speech, Mr. Albanese. But it's really interesting to think about what we can do other than use the term Indo-Pacific. And so the last kind of quick question, because we're almost out of time, both Stephen and Madeline, what do you think Australia might do to make real our engagement in the Indo-Pacific? And we've got some specific examples that the Leader of the Opposition has just laid out.
Well, I might answer that question and Hayley's question at the same time. It's not possible for a country like Australia to attract the President's attention more than once a year. But the real importance of a mainstream centrist Biden administration coming into office is that all of the positions which are then filled are filled by sensible mainstream people who understand the rebalance and the pivot. So we're engaging on a daily basis in terms of alliance, practical cooperation measures with people who understand the general strategy and then implement it. So if, for example, Australian officials go to the US and say, here's a really good idea for the Indo-Pacific, why don't we have a disaster relief exercise out of Darwin, Australia, US, Indonesia? Why don't we have a maritime naval exercise out of HMAS Sterling, south of Perth, Australia, US, India? Why don't we start thinking about what we can do with the Japanese self-defence force, which we haven't, in Australia's terms, we haven't engaged with since the tsunami disaster in Japan years ago and utilised all of our fleet of C-17s. It's really incumbent on us to go to the United States with practical Indo-Pacific operational measures, which on a bad day from the President's perspective would be a footnote. If anyone told Joe Biden, oh, by the way, Mr. President, we didn't tell you, but a few weeks ago we did an Australia, Indonesia, US exercise out of Darwin, his response would be, that's a good thing, you don't need my permission, just get on with it. So there's a whole range of measures which have frankly been neglected under the Trump administration and since the last year or so of the Biden administration, which is now incumbent upon Australian officials and Australian public policy players and practitioners to now start putting to their counterparts, whether they're at Indo-Pacific PACOM, whether they're Assistant Secretary Southeast Asia, whoever they are. If you wait for the President to start thinking about Australia, you'll get that chance once a year and nothing will be progress. So it's really the ball is in our court at multiple levels to now start advancing those issues.
Fantastic. Madeline, final comments?
Entirely agree with Stephen. Those operational projects are very important, but also what Anthony said about using that extraordinary national asset of the superannuation savings to invest in products through Southeast Asia and their infrastructure, just like as Governor Beazley, when he was US Ambassador, would not stop talking about how important Australia's investment into America is. We talk a lot about how gratefully we receive American investment here with the development in the north particular, but Australia's investment into the US is undersold, and what's behind that investment is the superannuation funds. But I think to make genuine Australia's engagement in the world, in the region in particular, is a really long-term project that we've dropped the ball on. And a lot of that's to do with language training in this country and the sharing of cultures with the region beyond just a lot of Western Australians travelling to Bali, which they can't do anymore. we've seen the Varghese report on the India relationship just sit on a shelf for nearly 3 years now, and what an extraordinary waste at a time when we should be building that.
And no response to Wadwa's report.
And no response to the Wadwa report, which is the similar report from the Indian side. You know, it's all very well, and that was a great test match, I might add, and I will talk about cricket as long as I can. But, you know, these...
Dare I say it, another example of Australia underestimating India?
Indeed, and what a springboard we could use this as. But, you know, we waste our opportunities. We've got the India-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and whereas that's just, you know, it's gone in a puff of smoke and nothing's really happened on it. And I know COVID makes things difficult, but nonetheless, we have to strive to make these relationships real. They don't, the depth of these relationships aren't there at the moment, and it's going to be more difficult to build them during this time, and we wasted the good times, I would think, so we really need to redouble our efforts. And part of that is this domestic understanding of the region in which we live, which is beyond just us talking about it in rooms like this and reading, you know, really fantastic pieces of work, but actually making the effort to learn the language, have a greater cultural understanding, and be ready when the time comes to be able to engage in a more sustained, long-term way, because we're not going to have this diversification in the region that everyone talks about without a long-term commitment of government leaders, members of the opposition leading, members of the public taking it upon themselves to think, what can we do to better understand the region so that we can make the most of our place within it? I think that's what's important.
Well, in that broader mission that you so eloquently described of making sure that the broader public understands that, we are well served by our political leaders, and today we've been well served by you, Mr. Albanese, in sharing your vision. You have helped the Perth US Asia frame our work for this year very well. We appreciate your making the time. We realize out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. See you in person soon.
All right, well, one of the advantages, obviously, of doing this virtually is we did get a glimpse of Toto, which we wouldn't have in real life presentation, but we look forward to hosting you back here in the future in person. On behalf of the Perth US Asia Centre, for those of you online and for those of you here in the room, please join me once again in thanking Professor Stephen Smith, Madeleine King, and of course our keynote speaker today, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Anthony Albanese. Thank you so much. That's fantastic.
Yeah.